Hi, good morning everybody. So I recognise a few faces from previous attendance and some of you may recognise me. Hopefully you won't get sick of seeing or hearing me during the course of the conference. I'll be keeping it nice and brief between sessions. But what I want to do next is welcome Ryan Harris, who's from the University of Southampton, and apologies if I pronounce this wrong, Valeen Dutia from Rubrik. And they're going to tell us how they've worked together at Southampton to simplify and future-proof the infrastructure. Over to you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Ooh, that was automatic. I guess first of all, given the theme of the event, infrastructure anywhere, infrastructure everywhere, it's quite nice to see so many friendly faces, and I think we know quite a few of the guys and people in the room. I guess many of you might have seen the presentation that Ed Poll did last year on Cranfield's journey to the cloud with Rubrik, and I guess firstly I'm pretty humbled by the fact that Rubrik has managed to get another customer to actually become another advocate for our solution and talk about Southampton's journey to the cloud. I don't want to steal any of Ryan's thunder today, but I just wanted to say a couple of quick words really around the market and where we've seen higher education as a vendor and as a partner in the USISE market. Been a USISE member for a couple of years, and I think the story that Ryan's going to tell, without taking anything away from what he's going to talk about, is a very common use case of how cloud is being leveraged, how customers are moving to a hybrid model with Rubrik. And I think one of the interesting things with the market is that the common use case of finding a way of leveraging the cloud has often become data that is non-transient, data that can help you to leverage the commoditized aspect of cloud storage, which is a story that Ryan's going to talk about and some of the benefits. I think with regards to infrastructure everywhere and infrastructure anywhere, the other piece is a personally interesting topic to me is about data governance, information assurance. And Rubrik started our journey with backup of on-prem data, but that data sprawl and the way that we've become a cloud-native capability to protect that data anywhere is becoming increasingly relevant to everyone in the room, I think, and all the conversations we're having across higher education and other conversations across public sector. So I think it's going to be quite an interesting story from Ryan to talk about where they're going from an on-prem environment and where that's taking the University of Southampton and what the benefits have been. I think the other piece is really around how it applies to other customers and prospective customers that we have in the room. So do come and talk to us afterwards, but I don't want to take anything more away from Ryan, so I'm going to hand over to Ryan. I think he's all mic'd up and ready to go. So.
Ready to go, yeah. Hello everyone, my name's Ryan. I'm a Senior Infrastructure Architect at the University of Southampton. I'd like to start first of all by the theme of this presentation to simplify that somewhat. I work in a team that handles the enterprise architecture and infrastructure that underpins the university's IT function. Firstly, I'd like to say to USISE and the infrastructure group, thanks for having us here. Working in higher education for quite a few years now, it's apparent to me that we're quite lucky to work in a sector that encourages and enables learning and sharing with others. So our aim today is to give you an insight into the University of Southampton's journey with Rubrik and how this has enabled backup and recovery transformation within our organisation. I'd like to start by talking a little bit about the university to start with. We're a world-leading, research-intensive university with a strong educational offering, renowned for innovation and enterprise. We have approximately 30,000 students and around 8,000 staff, although that by no means reflects the number of users we have in our directory. We have multiple data centres across several sites, backed up by a plethora of hub rooms and branch sites. We have to carefully consider corporate professional service, business requirements, as well as research and academic, or when we're designing infrastructure solutions. We also have a high-performance computing offering through Iridis, the largest top supercomputing sites in the UK. But the reason we're here and data management. The university's existing platform seemed to be a good potential candidate for digital transformation. It's large and it presents us many challenges in locality, simplicity, scale and cost. And this is about how we manage shifts in technology and industry practice to drive technical change. There are architectural challenges to simplify infrastructure through digital transformation, and this is where I came in. I'd like to talk a little bit about myself, if that's okay. To give you a history about me, I graduated from the University of Hertfordshire in 2006 with a degree in business IT. I then worked in several roles ranging from first line support through to third line, and I was a system admin for a while. This didn't kill my passion for IT or the user base, although it came really close. I started working for the university in 2010 in my first life in infrastructure operations. After several years, I then went out to work for a company in corporate sector that dealt with wide-scale networking and communications, where I was able to further understand my knowledge on Cisco networking and did a CCNA. At that point in my career, I'd worked with several technology stacks and started to focus my career more around data center technologies, including virtualization and all the encompassing components such as storage, servers, networks, and so on. And this is where my passion for VMware emerged. I started blogging, and I was lucky enough to be awarded the VMware vExpert community status. It's a community of evangelists for VMware. I was already a VMware certified professional, but I decided to pursue the advanced VMware vCAP certifications as well. Finally, in 2015, I was approached to rejoin the university in the design and architecture team. That's where I've been ever since. And during that time, I've broadened my horizons a little bit more by becoming Red Hat certified, which was one of the final pieces in my professional development to become a more well-rounded engineer and architect. And this is where our paths crossed with Rubrik for the first time. So, as an active member of the vExpert community, one of the main social media tools I use is Twitter. It enables me to follow other community members, technologists, and monitor trends and changes in the industry. For a large part of 2015 and early 2014, there was a buzz around a company called Rubrik, who were emerging in the space of backup recovery and data management. Thanks to the vExpert status I'd achieved, I was lucky enough to be awarded tickets to attend VMworld in San Francisco, where I was there to learn about data center technologies associated with VMware, virtualization, the cloud, and beyond. So, this was the first VMworld that Rubrik had also attended, and their stall stood out just a little, at least to me, because I'm a fan of Back to the Future. With the buzz on Twitter and their catchy stand, I was compelled to speak to them about their product and offerings. I was very lucky with talking with an engineer who worked for them, who actually used to work as a developer for VMware in the storage teams working on vSphere. Now, as a person who works in enterprise IT, I'm very much used to explaining what I do to non-technical people, to be met with a blank stare and glazed eyes. That's fair enough, I can understand that. I'm also very lucky to work with extremely talented guys at the university who far exceed my own realms of knowledge, but I can keep up with them just about. However, talking with the Rubrik engineer on that day, he absolutely blew me away with his technical ability, and rightly so. He was an extremely clever guy. This filled me with confidence as a technical person in the first instance, although walking away from the conversation with him, I didn't really feel very technical anymore. And that's where our journey started, I think. I returned to my role within the university, and I was fairly aware that in a recent time frame there'd been significant investment into a new primary data center and all the encompassing technologies around that. The end result of that was that we were running a 98% virtualized server workloads, with a few exceptions of physical hardware, as always. And the one thing that stood out to me after comparing it with my experience in industry is that we were still using a backup and recovery platform that hadn't had a refresh in 5 to 7 years. In my eyes, the leaps in technology that had been realized hadn't been applied to that platform, and it stood out to me as a clear area with room for improvement. To paint a very quick picture of our estate, we have around 2,000 virtual machines running across over 8 VMware clusters on Dell Compute, Tintri storage arrays, Cisco networking, and our physical footprint is pretty small, other than HPC, which is an absolute behemoth. So I would imagine that our legacy infrastructure looks something similar to most who haven't had the opportunity to refresh in the last 5 to 7 years. The footprint in the data center is extremely large, the infrastructure is monolithic, it requires a specific skill set to drive, and it keeps at least one of our full-time operational engineers busy managing it for most of the week. It's a classic model of agent on a server, which backs up over the network to a centralized disk cache controlled by the backup software, which then writes a copy of our backup data to tape to keep in our library and one to be sent off-site. It can be seen here. So we have the compute racks on the left with the storage array and the nodes required, and there's the 6-frame 24-drive library with a lot of tapes. This solution has served us extremely well in its tenure, but the scale isn't easy, and with the ever-changing trends and requirements, it's not an easy thing to manage moving forward with fairly limited flexibility. It's here that we embarked on a journey to review the existing platform to work out if there was a better solution for the job. We sort of went to a market review, and I'm not a backup guy. I did manage a small installation of Symantec Backup Exec in a previous life. I don't normally admit that out loud in public, so I wasn't very experienced with that. So I had an interesting fact-finding and discovery phase where I realized the true scale of the platform and its pros, its cons, and its costs. Not only that, but it helped me better understand the business requirements in backup and recovery, and tried my best to convert them into technical requirements in order to try and procure a new potential solution. And the requirements can fairly easily be condensed into the following. Where possible, reduce the total cost of ownership, save money, be more efficient, and do more with less. Enable flexibility in order to align us with the future plans. And the real key here is flexibility, and I will come back to that. We wanted to improve service level availability offerings by being able to granularly grant per service recovery point objectives. We wanted to increase performance in recoverability to improve on our existing RTOs. And we also wanted to ensure that the solution was simple, easily scalable, and manageable. So we took some time to review what was out there in the market. Part of this was the work that I was doing in VMworld, and we also had some vendors come in and speak with us on site. The take-home that I realised quite quickly is that a lot of the heavyweight vendors in the backup space, and traditionally aligned in the sort of top left of the Gartner Magic Quadrant for backup and recovery, they all have a fairly similar architecture to them, which isn't too dissimilar from our existing platform. From some of the very back of the envelope calculations, it did appear that we weren't going to meet our primary business requirements, specifically around TCO. This includes monetary spend as well as staff resources and time to make it happen. Not to say these solutions weren't all exceptional in their own way, they just didn't really map to our requirements. So what we had was left was a selection of vendors who were aligned to the niche or visionary area of the Magic Quadrant down there somewhere. And the problem with these vendors, or the challenge should I say, is that there's sometimes more questions asked around them because there's less history and standing in the backup market. However, I think my previous slide hopefully demonstrates the pedigree in the Rubrik senior leadership team and instills some confidence. We're extremely lucky as well at the University of Southampton in that our senior leadership team have a vision and long-term strategy which has enabled us to focus on adopting and embracing the cloud and new technologies where possible and sensible. And the real caveat on that is where possible and sensible. There are many obvious use cases coming out of the cloud which are almost no-brainers. A great example of this to us at least is the adoption of Office 365 and other software as a service applications. It really doesn't make sense to invest in infrastructure anymore when you can consume a commodity service. And in my eyes, the same could be said about cloud archive storage. So in early 2016, we engaged with several vendors who satisfied our requirements, but also had a modern cloud-native culture baked into them from inception. This was fairly serious to us in a world where cloud, hardware agnostic, software-defined, automation are all fairly serious trends. Something that built from the ground up on API-first architecture was very appealing. Some vendors don't provide a consumable API for their product, and some have built one as a kind of backwards compatible bolt-on, which can sometimes leave them a little clunky and lacking in documentation. We have an automation system at the university called Cortex. It's a virtual machine orchestration system for VMware, Infoblox, ServiceNow, Puppet, Red Hat Satellite, Microsoft DSC, and now Rubrik. It's written in Python Flask. We consume APIs for systems management, and as engineers, we consider this a technical fundamental when moving forward procuring a solution in the modern age. So we moved on to some proof of concepts. Just going to take a little drink. So after we'd shortlisted several vendors, including the latest offering from our existing, we set to work on running some proof of concepts in our sandbox test environment. The experience was really vital for us to get to grips with the products and really open them up as far as we could within the confines of a test environment. We had specific test criteria which we applied to each proof of concept to give the fairest comparisons possible. We're looking at things such as the delivery and installation. Were communications with the vendors good? Did the kit arrive on time? Was it easy to rack and stack? How long did the configuration take? Did we need 1 engineer, 5 engineers? Could we do it on our own? Did the product actually deliver what we were told it was going to deliver? And did it map to our existing requirements? Did it do what our current platform does? And hopefully did it add a lot more additional value? And finally, could we break it? Could we set a smart group of engineers loose on the product and make it fall over? It's what we love to do as techies, and it gives us a deeper understanding of how the product works. Thankfully, we weren't able to break any of the proof of concepts we trialed, and they were all returned in perfect working order. Rubrik was, of course, one of the chosen solutions that we trialled. In fairness to the trial and other vendors that we tested, they were all very good and almost identical in the tests that we performed. It's fair to say that Rubrik came out on top, as I'm here talking to you today about them. To be honest, there was very little in it, and our job would have been made extremely difficult, as all vendors delivered some excellent products. Thankfully, the two closest front runners in the race between them, one of them didn't quite meet one of the deliverables in our test section, which has effectively been able to provide a bare minimum of the requirement that our existing system is capable of. It seemed odd that something so small would be such a showstopper for us, but out of interest, we were looking to back up physical Linux servers, and at the time the vendor in question didn't have an agent for that. It's a really small requirement on our estate, but a requirement nonetheless, and when architecting a solution, I have to go on solid evidence and satisfaction that requirements will be met, rather than promises from a vendor roadmap, to which they did later on release that agent that we were looking for, but it was a bit too late. There are other technical preferences we had when choosing Rubrik. The key here really is preference as technical staff, a bit of a soft requirement. Their API and its documentation was really silky and well written, to the point that I can understand and use most of it, and I am not a developer by any sense of the word. Not only that, but at the time it was pitched as a backup and recovery platform with emerging cloud integration, and that's exactly what we were looking for. So after our proof of concepts were run, we returned the units that were lent to us, and we entered into several months of business paperwork, framework, review and process. The end result of this for us was that the university procured our first Rubrik appliance, an R348. This was in order to provide additional protection for our critical and priority systems. And to elaborate a little bit on that further, the university has the concept of critical and priority systems. If you were to review our business continuity planning documentation, it reads out all the hits you can imagine: student records, HR systems, digital learning, finance systems, the list goes on. These systems, by very nature of their existence, are the monster VMs, the huge databases, the multi-tier application architectures, and so on. They're near enough the most difficult to understand, install, configure, manage, and back up and recover. Providing additional backup protection and recovery capabilities for these systems using Rubrik was an absolute no-brainer. We weren't losing any functionality as we had them registered in our old system still, but we were bolstering our recovery options in the event of some unforeseen circumstances. And this was our dip a toe in the water in instigating a major change in the way in which we approach backup and recovery. It's also important to say at this time that Rubrik emerged as the chosen solution due to the immediate value that we could add to our backup and recovery capability. It gave us the flexibility. At the time of procurement of Rubrik, there was quite a lot of uncertainty at the university, which was out of our control as technical staff. There was groundwork going into the future 10-year plans, which meant that we didn't have the full vision of where we needed to be. It didn't really matter though, because Rubrik seemed to offer us plenty of options. To give you an idea, from our perspective, all things infrastructure are under review. Where we might be hosting our services from in 5-10 years. Will we be building a new secondary data center? Will we go colo? Will we go cloud? Would we still be using VMware as a hypervisor? Will we go to Hyper-V or something else? The technology stack as a whole was under entire review. And also we were looking at how we could best understand and adopt the cloud where it would be best suited. It seemed though that regardless of the direction that we would be put on, Rubrik would be able to cater for our requirements. If we wanted to leverage backup infrastructure workloads in the cloud, if we wanted to use cheap cloud storage for archival, if we wanted to use multiple clouds, if we wanted to cover our remote sites, or if we just wanted to stay on premises and replicate our backup data and maybe use a private cloud. All of these things were covered. And the list of features has grown rapidly over the years. As Rubrik has matured, the product has grown. So after our first brick was procured, we set off and had it working. We started the plan of how we would transform and transition from our existing platform, which brought us into a phase of automation and development. We had a period of wait at the university whilst the final strategy and direction was coming into fruition. This is an excellent opportunity for us as technical teams to plan for future expansion of the platform. We were able to put some work into technical development of the solution to cater for our needs. Having the Rubrik flexibility and consumable API really enabled us to build capability and integration into our existing systems. And this is where we started work on Cortex integration. As I mentioned earlier, Cortex is our automation infrastructure provisioning platform. Some very clever chaps in our team set to work on developing a section within Cortex specifically for Rubrik. This started with pulling out basic information on the backup history for any given system, but it's evolved over time and continues to evolve, including being able to granularly define an SLA domain for a given system. An SLA domain in Rubrik speak is a backup policy. The work on automation enabled the rest of our engineers to focus more on other automation and not having to look after the existing system, and it also enabled our other infrastructure operational engineers to become a bit more involved and understand the workings of the backup platform because the skill set previously was too sheer. We also used the development time to understand how we could migrate our estate and what would be needed to achieve this. Our current platform has the requirements of most, multiple flavors of Windows and Linux ranging from physical and virtual, plenty of SQL and Oracle. We really wanted to utilize some point-in-time recovery capability that Rubrik would provide us. We also have MariaDB in the form of MySQL, we've got Postgres, we've got a small instance of MongoDB somewhere. We've got a lot of things to look after. It's important to say at this stage that we're working out the technical detail of migration planning and how we would get there. Which thankfully after some testing and documentation seemed fairly straightforward. Although at the time we were only really using the system for a specific use case and wouldn't be able to realize the true benefit until we were able to scale out the platform. At this stage we were also experimenting with cloud out archiving on a very small scale, utilizing cloud storage for backup archives. We realized that we would need a greater insight into the Azure platform as the cloud would become a large dependency for this service. So we acquired a pre-built dashboard online for Grafana, which is publicly available, and we've taken it and customized it slightly again to incorporate into our current dashboards, so we now have a quick and easy way of looking at all the storage account statistics for our tenancy. This is something that we've grown and tailored over time, and a screenshot of it can be seen here. During the period of development, we also renewed our VMware Enterprise License Agreement, and along with this came some licenses for their virtualization, networking and security product, NSX. This enabled us fairly easily to do some technical magic with the networks in our testing environment. This meant that with a bit of extra thought, we could replicate our existing infrastructure in a small bubble. Once this was built, we were able to start testing the possibility of automating recoveries and, more importantly, testing recoveries of systems in a way in which we were never able to do before. Recoveries at the university were traditionally aligned to the recovery capability. Our existing processes of rebuilding systems was fairly dated, and whilst robust in proving that documentation and backups were correct, they were slow and time-consuming. Using a combination of everything I've just mentioned, we're able to prove with a high level of confidence that we could recover a whole service, compromising multiple tiers of architecture with much less administrative effort in unprecedented timeframes using Rubrik Mount and instant recovery capability. And this was quite an exciting prospect for us moving forward for the business and technical staff alike. And that brings us on to the present day. This year has been an exciting time for the university. All the hard work the department has put into the long-term planning has enabled our senior leadership team to identify a viable strategy and vision moving forward to align us as an IT department with the university as a business. This enabled us to invest into Rubrik further with the total aim of reducing that total cost of ownership and improving the capability on the estate. We had some capital investment on infrastructure projects which aligned to our backup and recovery business case and roadmap, which meant that we were enabled to engage with Rubrik and our trusted partner to understand the requirements to cover our entire estate. In turn, this was able to highlight a lower total cost of ownership over the duration of our 10-year plan. A project was initiated which involved procurement of additional data center technologies to align to the IT strategy. This included all the additional servers and networks and things like that. But for the purpose of this talk, most importantly, is the Rubrik cluster expansion. So fast forward from the inception of the project, where we worked with vendors closely to create a design for the environment to ensure requirements are met and that it delivered from a performance and capacity standpoint, we had a new delivery of technology in the data center, and as the technical team, all of our Christmases had come early. Rubrik sells themselves on simplicity, and on the day of implementation it was extremely simple, just like the proof of concept that we trialed and our first ever unit that was installed. However, being a customer, we didn't really want things too easy. So thanks to multiple plates spinning at the same time, we did have a few teething issues, but these were entirely related to the way in which we'd configured our environment. A good example of this is that we were adhering to some new networking and security best practices. This meant that on the day of implementation, we were moving our Rubrik cluster physically in a data center. We're then also logically moving it on the network and then adding the new nodes for cluster expansion. But this caused a slightly unexpected outcome. At this point, I'm dying to crowbar in a little bit of geek talk into the presentation, so please bear with me. Rubrik is built on simplicity of scale. When you add new nodes or bricks to the cluster, it uses multicast DNS for node-to-node discovery. And this is built on the Apple Bonjour service, which is a zero configuration networking technology. This includes service discovery, and as such, all the devices need to sit on the same layer 2 networking segment. We did adhere to the setup requirements and the setup and installation requirements, but we were unable to discover the new nodes to add to our cluster. The discovery just wasn't working. So with a bit of troubleshooting, we finally nailed the problem down to the fact that we had IGMP snooping enabled on the network. This effectively prevents multicast traffic flooding on the switch. We had to disable this configuration on the Rubrik VLAN, which stopped the multicast filtering that was taking place, and everything was able to discover and carry on working. It was a small hurdle to overcome on the day, but it was an important lesson learned for us moving forward. So within less than a day, our cluster had been fully expanded and was back online. And due to the hyper-converged nature of the technology, the expansion included capacity in the form of disk and SSD, in the form of compute, in memory and CPU, and a load of additional 10 gig networking. So we'd expanded. Now what? The project we worked on was multiple infrastructure. The other part of this work was to re-architect and refresh our secondary data center technologies to align them with the architecture of our primary data center. And this gave us a unique opportunity to stand up a new virtual platform and use it for recovery testing before we migrated our existing secondary data center workloads to it. Previously, I've talked about recovering critical services into a small sandbox bubble. It runs on old hardware, is now to support. It's a classic development ground. It's good for that, but not really for production testing. So, as part of the testing of the new platform and Rubrik and the infrastructure that we procured, we took this concept idea of NSX and applied it over our virtual platform once it had been built and configured to our standards. We were able to recreate our entire networking infrastructure with a relatively small amount of ease. So we had a networking like for like, we had load balancing services in the form of F5 networks, hardware load balancers, and we also have DNS, NTP, and DHCP, which are provided to us in the form of info blocks. So there's disaster recovery. So all of these components that I've just mentioned are fundamental from an infrastructure perspective. We currently run physical hardware appliances for these services, which are configured in site high availability. Rebuilding the network using NSX was fairly trivial. That's what the product is for, and microsegmentation is its most simple use case. We also had to configure our load balancing and DNS services, which we essentially restored a copy of our backups from our current systems into virtual appliances provided from the vendors into this isolated environment. This had to be tweaked slightly because we were recovering a backup from a hardware appliance and putting into a virtual appliance, so there's some tweaking to be done, but we'd learned that in our development and automation phase. The aim of the test, we wanted to recover all of our important systems in isolation in order to prove confidence in the newly acquired infrastructure and to test the true potential of the recoverability with Rubrik. This involved understanding all of our systems on the business continuity planning documentation, their architecture, dependencies, and configuration specifics. It was a good fact-finding exercise and a refresh opportunity. It was decided to document each service in the form of a runbook. I stole this idea shamelessly from Rubrik's own automation engineer, Josh Stenhouse. He's an extremely clever chap, and a while back he wrote some PowerShell scripts for automating and testing recoveries. We took this idea and ran with it a little bit, creating runbooks, which included environment-specific configuration details for each service relevant to the organization. We were then able to write some further scripts, which enabled us to manipulate the recovery of hundreds of systems, as clicking through a GUI for each one isn't really going to yield a timely result. This was repeatable and doable for each service that held a runbook. As for recovery, we had 2 days planned where we would initiate a fake disaster in our primary data center, then a combined effort across multiple teams in the department from service management, infrastructure, applications and database teams was all made to implement and document the recovery. As infrastructure teams, we had configured and tested all the components in dry run scenarios to make sure it all worked and was all documented and understood. And this was extremely handy, as at the time of conducting this test, my second son decided he'd be extremely late to the world, overlapping my paternity leave with the due date all this work was scheduled for. I feel that this DR test was made even more real in the fact that one of the architects responsible for introducing Rubrik to the organisation, who designed a lot of the, and configured some of the new infrastructure and planned a lot of the recovery testing, wasn't actually present on the day it took place. I did apologise profusely to my colleagues, and I still owe them several beers. So the result is, how did it all go? The answer is extremely well. The headline for us is that we managed to successfully recover all of our critical and priority services in a working manner inside of our recovery bubble in a timely fashion. To elaborate on this further, the successful recovery included most things that you would need to get things working on a technical level. Directory services, authentication in ADFS and Shibboleth, infrastructure specific such as Puppet masters and antivirus management systems. We then moved on to mail routing systems, the finance systems, the HR systems, the student records, the data integration, identity management. The list is long. I'm going to stop there because I think that kind of paints an idea of what we managed to do. Now, as an organisation, we'd never fully tested a recovery of all of our important systems in one go at the same time. We also managed to recover a system or two that had never actually previously gone through a modern recovery. To me, this was the biggest step change in life after Rubrik. Previously, it's fair to say that we'd have been met with many technical challenges in recovering it to this level. Not only technically, but the body count would have been much greater, and the time taken would be pretty difficult to estimate. We recovered all of our critical and priority services in around 25 hours, which was when the exercise was closed. This meant that I've just turned the screen off somehow. But we managed to recover everything in 25 hours, which was when the exercise closed. And this meant that all servers and everything was brought back and recovered. It was all stood up and checked and working, and each application was tested by the subject matter experts of each and signed off and documented. So I'd like to provide an additional bit of nerdery around what we did on the day. I say we, I wasn't there. We recovered approximately 220 systems ranging from Microsoft Server 2008 R2 through to 2019, multiple systems on Red Hat running Red Hat 5 through to 7. We recovered over 100 terabytes of data to our new storage arrays. That included 16 Microsoft SQL servers, 14 Oracle servers, a single MySQL server, and also a MySQL cluster. We also saw peak recovery traffic from the Rubrik appliances to our storage arrays over the switch interconnects, equating to around 55 gigabit per second throughput, which means that we were recovering around 6 to 7 gigabytes a second. We were extremely pleased with the performance of the new infrastructure. And then a final note on the present day is that we'll soon be in receipt of a large amount of data real estate square footage, thanks to the Rubrik footprint of 8Us in our rack. So, where to now? After all the fun of procurement of testing, where do we go? Well, we're now on a course to realise the savings that the new system can provide us. Since expansion and testing have finished, we've loaded up the remainder of our estate into Rubrik. And this is a fundamental driver for us in the migration away from our existing infrastructure, which is now at the forefront of our work. We're also reviewing and amending our backup policies. We're using Microsoft Azure as a cloud-out archive target, and cloud-out is effectively the Rubrik words for putting your backups out off-site, off the appliances, locally out into the cloud. We're also constantly automating and also periodically reviewing the new features from Rubrik. We're looking at cloud expansion, to which I think Phil is now going to come and say a few words.
Thanks, Ryan. I think what's really common about this sector is that Ryan and the University of Southampton's story is not an uncommon journey. So Ryan talks about putting the backup data into the cloud using our cloud-out technology. I think the exciting piece for me is that we're working together now on the Southampton's journey to really leverage cloud for other use cases and looking at things like the wider data protection across Office 365, across potential future cloud workloads. And actually, the story that Ryan talks about, which is founded around automation and the API, founded around simplicity, flexibility, has actually resulted in a really rigorous DR testing of a very large-scale university environment with lots of complicated and legacy systems. I think that's probably one of the hardest use cases to test DR in, as opposed to, on the other end of the scale, some of the other higher education organisations that are in the room are probably much smaller and much more modern and much more simple, but it's a really good test. And I think the next stage is really looking, or the future stage, looking at things like, how do we look at that information governance? How do we take the metadata that Rubric's capturing and giving the capability to do things like ransomware detection and recovery, or going back to information governance that I mentioned earlier, but actually looking at data classification. How can we look at that data and say, should that data really be held for so long? Should that data really be kept there? Is that GDPR compliant? Is there personally identifiable information in my systems where it shouldn't be, and actually leveraging the backup data to do that? So it's quite an exciting journey with the University of Southampton, and I'm probably not alone in saying it's a true partnership, which has been really, really good for us, and it's been something that we've worked on with the university over probably 3 years now. Yep. So that's good. And I said at the beginning, it's really humbling to have to strive for customers that are happy, but then to have customer advocates that 2 years in a row we've had customers talking about their journey, and that journey often starts with the backup data. So yeah, I think it's an exciting story that's not quite finished and continues. So but I just wanted to make sure we thank Ryan for his advocacy as well as sharing the story, really.
Yeah, no worries. And that kind of brings us to the end of our story with the journey with Rubric so far. As you can see, we've done quite a lot, and there's plenty more to do, but the possibilities for us are no longer limited by a legacy incumbent. I've talked quite a lot over the last half hour, I do apologise, but the journey has been straightforward for us and simple, and we're on track to realise savings this financial year by eliminating costs of our incumbents, so things like hardware maintenance, software support, additional licensing, all of those things. And regardless of the direction that we may be on now or in several years, we feel as though a technical team and a department that we've acquired a solution that will cater for our data management needs in a world of rapid development and change. So I guess...
really just to wrap up, we're here obviously today and tomorrow, so if you've got a similar challenge, or if you're interested in how Rubric would fit, then come and speak to us. But the last thing that my colleagues have reminded me not to forget to mention is that we have got a raffle draw on the stand like every other partner that's in the room, so do come and enter the draw, which is for a set of Apple AirPods. So thanks again, Ryan.
Nice to always. Does anyone have any questions at all? So we presented the business with several options in terms of risk, really. We had that option to completely cut out the data center, switch all our networking and routing to the secondary, fail over all of those services, to which, as a technical team, we believe it was possible, but hadn't been done before, and there was a larger amount of risk associated to that than being able to sort of create an environment that's almost identical and like for like, but just not physically having to make that change to impact the business through operational working hours and things like that. So that's the route we took. Yeah.
Sorry. So this is for your corporate systems data. How are you handling your research data that you have?
That's a good question. So our research data is on an entirely separate platform. We use EMC's Isilon for that, and that consists of petabytes and petabytes of data. And generally we try and find the best solution for the particular use case, and we currently have our own separate way of dealing with file store in terms of replication and backup. So Rubric doesn't cover that yet, but there is potential for that in the future. Hello. Yes.
Were they live tests with your business?
No, so as I alluded to with the gentleman just now, we failed everything over, and we were able to get insight into the isolation environment without impacting our current working system. So we essentially recovered everything from the previous working night into a bubble that consisted of our current configuration, from DNS, DHCP, directory services, the whole lot you can imagine. So it was a very good test to stand everything up from a crash consistent state, I guess, and to know that it would work on the new platform. If that situation ever arose, we would flick the network over and do some other technical changes, and then recover as we did, just not into the isolated NSX bubble, but into the real environment. Anything else at all? I'm probably going to be around all day, so if anyone wants to ask me anything, please come and say hello. Thank you.
If you could join me in just giving a round of applause to Ryan and Zoe. Thank you very much.